Hello, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. This is Jim McKeeth, and thanks for joining me today for targeting Windows 10's Windows Subsystem for Linux with Delphi for Linux. That's not a mouthful. I'm not sure what is. I'm pretty excited about this. I really like Windows 10. I think it's a great operating system, great upgrade from previous versions of Windows. One of the things about Windows 10 is they're always rolling out new features, and one of the features they rolled out in the Anniversary Edition, which is back when we released Seattle, was the Windows Subsystem for Linux. They've been incrementally improving it over time, and then recently, now available Insider Build, is the Windows Subsystem for Linux 2. So let's take a look at the Windows Subsystem for Linux, how to use it, and how to use it from Delphi. It's the agenda. I kind of mentioned some of this already, but we'll cover it in more detail. So in case you missed the memo, if you've been around Microsoft and Linux for a while, this is news. It wasn't too long ago that the Microsoft and Linux were at odds and competitive and not getting along very well. But a few years ago, with the number of changes at Microsoft loves Linux and is supporting it like crazy. And the latest of which is the Windows Subsystem for Linux. Now, if you look back at the timeline of the Windows Subsystem for Linux, before we get to the timeline, sorry. The Windows Subsystem for Linux is a compatibility layer on Windows that lets you run Linux programs, ELF format, specifically ELF64, natively on Windows 10 and Windows Server 2019. They have multiple distributions. They started with Ubuntu, but now they have a few different ones to choose from, or you can make your own. They're all through Microsoft Store, or you can get them other ways as well. It's mostly focused on command line interface, but there is some GUI support as well. You have to run your own X11 server or X Windows server on your Windows machine. And it was built as a collaboration between Microsoft and Linux. So Canonical is the group behind Ubuntu, one of the arguably most popular Linux distributors out there. And originally, WSL was built as a collaboration between them. Since then, it's been expanded and other distributions have come on board, but it is very collaborative between Microsoft and Linux Foundation. Microsoft's now part of the Linux Foundation as well. The advantages of this over a virtual machine is there's less hardware abstraction and better Windows integration than traditional virtual machines. So this isn't so much a virtual machine or a separate system that's running as it is part of your system, which is really kind of weird, but it takes a little getting used to. Once you do it, it's quite nice. And if you're familiar with Wine, Wine is a system on Linux that lets you run Windows apps on Linux. Wine stands for Wine is not an emulator. And it is a Windows emulator, I guess. Not quite, though. It's a compatibility layer, much similar to how WSL works. So it's kind of like a reverse Wine, if you will. Although the difference is Windows Subsystem for Linux was built collaboration between Windows and Linux, whereas Wine was not. It was purely by the Linux community. So some of the benefits and use cases, hopefully you're on here, you kind of have an idea why you'd want to do this. If not, really it comes down to this being the lowest friction, least overhead way of having a Windows or a Linux test box to test your Linux applications on. So most likely you have a server someplace that you want to deploy your Linux applications to, or maybe you're developing a kiosk type application with a FireMonkey for Linux GUI user interface, and that box is somewhere else, right, or is in development or something like that. And you need a way to quickly turn around and build and test your Linux applications from your Windows box. That's where this comes in. It's the easiest way, least overhead. It actually unlocks a lot of other things for you too. If you want to have other things that are specific to Linux, you can access those right from Windows. It blurs the lines, really get the best of both worlds. You get all of Linux and all of Windows running together in one system. So you can have a local build environment. You can use Eventually with Windows Subsystem for Linux 2, they're going to have Docker support, Docker for Linux support on under Windows Subsystem for Linux. You can have local testing server. There's no need to mess with dual booting or third-party virtual machine installations. And the cool thing is that the integration, right? You can, from Linux, run a Windows program. So on the Linux side, you can type in the name of a Windows program, and it will launch it on Windows. And then from the Windows side, you can launch Linux programs, and it just launches them. It works. It's really kind of cool. I will link you to some of the videos where Microsoft goes into more detail on that. I will show just some basics of that. Also, it runs as you need it, so you don't have. There's not really so much of a concept of booting it up and turning it off as you would a virtual machine or a separate computer. It just kind of runs as you need it. So now let's talk about the timeline. Interestingly, if you go all the way back to 1993, when Windows NT was introduced, it introduced the idea of subsystems. This allowed the Windows NT kernel to support Win32. Win32 is a subsystem in Windows NT, POSIX, OS2, etc. In 99, they replaced the POSIX subsystem with the Windows services for Unix, which is not Linux, it's similar. In 2001 is when XP came out. XP was important because prior to XP, we had Windows 95, or Windows 3.1, Windows 95, Windows 98, Windows ME, and those were a separate consumer-oriented OS, where you had the Windows NT in this other grouping that was a separate technology, separate from the consumer version. XP combined those together, which gave you all the functionality of NT in the consumer version of Windows. In 2004, they end of life the Windows services for Unix and was no longer around anymore. Now, in 2016, so 3 years ago, was the initial Windows Subsystem for Linux release in Windows 10 Anniversary Edition. Initially, only supported Ubuntu, like I mentioned, but they've initially added other things as well. That's WSL 1. WSL 2 was just announced in June of this year. There's been a number of improvements since the initial release, including additional distros, but WSL 2 is a huge improvement. One thing about WSL 1, actually, we're going to talk about architecture in a minute. WSL 2, I'm not using WSL 2 today. I will point you to some information about it. I did not want to, I figured you wanted to see things you could do, and you may not be comfortable with going down a insider build of Windows right now. So you can use WSL 1 just fine under your version of Windows. Like I said, it's been released for 3 years now. You should be running the latest version of Windows, Windows 10. There's compatibility patches. It's currently stable right now. It's a good idea to be on 1903, the one I'm on, but this will work with previous versions as well. Architecture of WSL 1, it is a emulation layer. It runs emulation over the Windows NT kernel and Windows file system. It uses this special driver to broker the information back and forth between the Windows system and the Linux subsystem. Then it's what's called a Pico process, which is a process without the Win32 PEB, so it doesn't have all the additional overhead of Win32, and then the ELF binaries execute atop there inside the Linux compatibility layer. All the system calls are mapped into Windows NT. Now, the interesting thing is they had to build it in WSL1 with the developers that were building it could not look at the Linux kernel, because if they looked at the Linux kernel, then there would be crossover copyright issues. So they did not want to be shipping the Linux kernel. Any Linux code, all that is shipped through the Windows Store by third parties. They wanted to only be shipping their own instance, their own code. So there was they implemented it without looking at the Linux code. So that's kind of a weird thing, but they wanted to do the best they could to make it compatible. And then since then, have improved it as well. Like I said, the file system is also virtualized. It's a virtualized on top of the Windows file system. So there may be some issues where it's not completely compatible or the same. If these are the distributions that are currently available in the Windows Store, there's Ubuntu, SUSE, Kali. So actually, I'll do them by families. So Ubuntu and Kali are both in the Debian family with Debian. Penguin is a version specific for Windows Subsystem for Linux. It's made to be take advantage of that as much as possible. I bought a copy of it for $10. If you want to or not, that's your choice, whether you think it's worth going down that route. If you're not familiar with Kali Linux, it's specifically around cybersecurity and pen testing. Then SUSE and Fedora Remix are in the Red Hat RPM family. So that's kind of the different families of Linux. The Delphi's Linux support is specifically around Ubuntu and Red Hat, so it should work with all of those no problem. Alpine WSL is a independent, lightweight, security-oriented Linux distribution. It's independent in that it's not part of either of the families that I saw, although I didn't dig into it too much. Usually most of these you can dig into and see where they fork off of one of the existing families, Debian and Red Hat being the big ones, although SUSE is a pretty large one as well. One thing also, the Ubuntu, if you search for Ubuntu specifically, you'll find that there are multiple versions, so there's 3 different versions of Ubuntu. The Ubuntu one, the main one, is whatever the current LTS is, or you can get ones that are specific to a certain LTS, whether it be 16.4 or 18.4. For installing it, you can either do the, so it came in Fall Creators Update 3 years ago. I'm currently on 1903 build 18362, which is the current version. You need to, first of all, enable Windows Subsystem for Linux, which you can do via PowerShell, or go into Control Panel's Windows Features and check Windows Subsystem for Linux. And then you can install the distro of your choice. You can do that either through Windows Store, like I just showed, or you can download it via script. And they also have support for building your own distro. So really, you could put any distro you wanted on here, set it up, pre-installed, however you want to do that, create your own distro installation. Once you install the distro, you then have to initialize it. So download it from the store is really quick, and then the initialize will take a few minutes, and it sets everything up, and it's going to prompt you for a password. There is a way to reset the password by changing the user to root, and then from root, changing the password, and then changing the user back again. And that way, you don't. If you do forget your password, you can get around that. If you do a search for it online, you should be able to find an article about that. But you don't usually need, you only will be typing your password in when you are doing sudo. It will launch as that user with the password already every time you launch it, so you don't need to type the password in to log in each time. But you do need it for a sudo. I think there's a way actually set it up to not require the password for sudo, but I don't know the details on that offhand. Once you've done that, you can then launch it. There's 4 different ways. You can tap the icon on the start menu. You can type the distro name, for example, Ubuntu. You can do WSL, which is Windows Subsystem for Linux. That's WSL is also the management utility, or Bash. So just from a command shell or PowerShell or the run box, WSL or Bash will launch it. And then you can do a specific thing where you where you run a specific command. So you can do WSL space run and then tell it what you want it to run in your default Windows Subsystem for Linux distro, or you can say the name of the distro, so Ubuntu, and what you want to run, or you can say bash-c and what you want it to run. So that way you can just run it and then be done when it comes back. So it really very flexible in the way that you run these. Here's some useful things for managing it. You can find more information at the link down at the bottom. WSL-L or --list will list your distros. You can do all the distros or just the running distros. You can change your default distribution. So that's the distribution that launches when you do WSL. you can run a in specific distro either by typing the distro's name or WSL distribution name, and then you can run the distro's specified user. So that's useful for when you need to, for example, run it as root so that you can reset your password because you forgot your password, which I may have done already a couple times. And then you can use unregister, and that will unregister the files for use with WSL, so it disconnects the files, and then if you do that, you can reinstall it, and you've lost all the things. So if you were like reboot, reset, that's what the step you do there. And if you're prior to 1903, which is the current version, so if you're not fully updated, then you use WSL config instead of WSL for those commands above. There's the path: user profile, app data, local packages, and you'll find some sort of name in there that's kind of mangled, but will include like the distro name and like canonical if it's Ubuntu or something like that. And you can find it in there, and you can dig into it further to find those files. But don't modify them from Windows with WSL1. WSL1, it uses a layer on top of the Windows file system, and so if you edit them from Windows, then Windows doesn't understand the stuff, the metadata that's added on there, and you'll destroy the metadata, which will make a mess of it. WSL2 fixes that. For targeting it from Delphi for Linux, I'm going to use the Ubuntu LTS 1804, but this should work with all of them. You first need to install the developer tools Delphi needs, just like any other Delphi instance, and install PA server. Now, you'll notice here in the install PA server that I'm copying it from Mount C program files. This is the location of where it's installed here. So you can actually access your entire Windows file system from within the WSL. So I just untar it right there from the thing. So this is much more convenient. You don't have to copy files around, anything like that. I also rename it from the 20 to just PA server. That makes it, at least in my mind, easier to work with. If you had multiple instances, that'd be a big deal. But the reason I do this is because if you don't do that, then it creates a your scratch dir separately in a different subfolder. So I just like having them all in one spot. And then you run it. And then here's how you could run it from Windows. So I mentioned before, you can type distro name run and then the command, or WSL and the command, and that will run it. If you want to do GUI applications, this is the one I'm using here. It's X410, which is for sale. I think it was like $10 in the Microsoft Store, or there's a couple open source options. I just like, hey, I'm going to buy it because then I just felt like that was the way to go, but you could certainly use one of these options as well. My thought was hopefully that this one would be easier. I found that still had to go through their website and follow some steps to make it work, which was kind of disappointing when I paid money for it. But anyway, so you have to install the required WSL packages. And in this case, I'm using XFCE4 desktop environment. So you have to have a Windows Manager is not installed by default with these systems. They're just command line, like server side only. But then you can install Xorg and let's see, libgtk3 and then XFCE4 for the commands you need. You'll probably end up installing a few other things because by default installs nothing. Then you launch your X server on Windows. This launches it in desktop mode. The start/B means do it in the background. Actually, start means do it in the background. /B means don't display the window. And this puts it in desktop mode. You can run with X410. You can run it in desktop mode or floating windowed mode. So floating window means each application you launch will have its own window, whereas desktop mode gives you the full Linux desktop experience. And then here's a script for launching Ubuntu. Then you have to do this export display right here, export display 127.0.0.0. This says tells the Windows server how to get to your Windows server. So since you're running X410 or one of these other Xming or VCXSRV in your on the Windows side, if you will, you have to point it to that. Okay, so this is pointing it to that. Now it's 127.0.0.1 because you're on the same machine, even though you are there's a Windows side and a Linux side, and there's still a Windows side and a Linux side, but they're really tightly integrated. So it's kind of interesting that way. Then here's where it's launching the window manager, and then when the window manager closes, then it just cleans up and removes the SSH agent so that it disconnects from the server. Once you've done that, you can launch or debug your GUI apps. For maximum automation, you can go through, and I just added it to the Delphi tools, IDE tools. And I added two options here. There's Ubuntu GUI and Ubuntu Terminal. For Ubuntu Terminal, you see here I just put the run. So I call Ubuntu run PA server, and then I do -password equals blank, and that does it without a password, so it doesn't prompt me for password. So that way PA server is just up and running and ready to connect with. If you want to launch the GUI, then here's the batch file, which I got this off X410's website, which was on the previous page, or not the previous page, but the page where I introduced X410, with a slight modification to it. I don't know what the slight modification was. I think I changed it from the version-specific one to the LTS generic one. Inside XFCE4, I then set it up to automatically launch PA server when I launch the GUI, and you do that through application settings. And here's the command you do here. I have a video that'll show you how this is done in a second. So you just dig in here, applications, settings, setting manager, and you're going to get a window that comes up, and from there you're going to select sessions and startup, although you could select it here, I guess, as well. I should notice that. And then go to the application auto start tab, hit add, and then give it a friendly name, and then this command. So exo-open launch terminal emulator is going to bring up the terminal emulator, which you can find that by right-clicking on this and viewing the properties of it, and then you tell it the command to run in the terminal emulator. And then when you launch the GUI environment, it's going to pop up with the terminal emulator with PA server already running and the password set to blank. I've already got WSL installed in my system here. I'll show you WSL-L. Oops, L. But I have the specifically 1804. I don't have the regular Ubuntu, so I'm going to go ahead and install that for now so you can just see the whole process here. So if we come in here and just type Linux in the Microsoft Store, we'll see run Linux on Windows, or if you search, it'll just come up and say, hey, do you want to run Linux on Windows? And you say, yeah, that's what I want to do. And it brings you to this page here, and you can select what you want to install. Now this is showing just straight up Ubuntu. If I search for Ubuntu, see, this is the banner I was talking about. You'll see that we have two different other Ubuntus you can choose from here, 1804 and 1604 LTS. This is LTS as well. I don't know exactly what the difference is. I looked at it at one point, and I don't remember it now. It installs the latest stable Ubuntu LTS release. So if I install one of the Ubuntus, that 1804 or 1604, it'll always be that version. Whereas this one will be the latest LTS release. So it makes sense to install that and to use that as my default, since that's what Rad Studio specifically will be supporting at the time. Right now, 1804 is the default. Okay, so I've installed that, so I'm going to go ahead and launch it. And it came up on the wrong screen, but here it is here. This is going to take a couple seconds here. This is just initializing it, putting all the files out. So the download was pretty quick. This will take a few minutes. By the way, this is the new Windows Terminal. It's pretty slick. I really like it. Windows Terminal Preview. Definitely recommend taking a look at it. You can add in your own command prompts, like this is the one with the variables all set up in here for Rad Studio command line access. You can, by default, all the Ubuntu's or all the Windows Subsystems for Linux to install show up in here as well. If you go to settings, it's open up the profiles.json file that you can customize to add things in there. So definitely recommend this, taking a look at it. Totally separate from what we're doing here, but it integrates nicely into all this. Oh, that's done already. That was a lot quicker than I expected. All right, so we need to provide a new Unix username, or we're on Linux, but it's a Unix username because it's a Linux-based system. So I'm just going to go with Delphi and my password. There we go. We're done. We've set it up. Ubuntu is now installed. So I want to install and set this up for development. So the first thing I want to do is do the apt update, and that's going to update the list of all the packages that are available to me. So it's going to go out and hit the server and do that. Can I make this bigger? Okay, it's done. It's saying that I have 119 packages that can be upgraded. I'm not going to upgrade all those right now, although that would be... I'll go ahead and do that, and then we'll make you watch it. PT upgrade. So that will upgrade all of them. And it will take a minute, but it's going to ask me, are you sure this is going to take 230 megabytes of downloads? I'll say, yeah. Let's do it. And then fast forward, so you don't have to watch it. And it's done. I realized after I did that, I probably should have done a full upgrade instead, which lets it remove things it doesn't need to remove. It probably doesn't make a whole lot of difference. So now I need to install the libraries needed by Delphi for Linux support, and that is the sudo apt install libcurl4 GNU tils dev and build essential. This is what I found are the ones required for 1804. So I'll say yes, go ahead and do that. This is going to take again a while. It's going to take another 162 megabytes. So, wow, a lot more. So again, I will hit fast forward. Now I need to do auto remove to clean things up, and this will just remove any packages that are no longer needed because of the updating, upgrading, etc. And nothing needs to be removed. So yay for that. Now I need to install PA Server. I could just download it from the web, but I can also get to it from my C drive. This is my C drive on my computer. So I can go into Program Files, and then go into Embarcadero, Studio, and then 20.0 because I'm in Rio. And now I want to go into PA Server. And there it is. So I'll just say CP for copy, Linux, PA Server, and I'll just copy it right to my home directory. And then I'll go into home directory. And there it is. So I want to extract this. So I'll say tar xf and name of the file. And I'll remove it. Remove write protected writer file. Yes, it's write protected because I copied it over and it was write protected where it came from. And now I want to rename this. So I hit move PA server, and I'm just going to call it PA server instead of -20. And then I go into here and I run it. And I'll leave the password blank for now. And I'm going to get a pop-up saying security alert, and I'll say yep, and see, you can actually see here the path to where it's running at. It's in users, your username, app data, local packages, and then each distribution you have has its own folder that's in there. It's got some sort of so canonical group is the name of the group that makes is who makes it, limited. Ubuntu on Windows is the name of the package, and then it has a GUID looking thing there. And so then we have local state root fs, that's where the file system is, and then it's home, Delphi, PA server, PA server. So home is the users folder, Delphi is the name of my user, PA server is the folder it's in, and PA server is what's running. Okay, so now you know where that's at. But until WSL2 comes out, you don't want to modify any files in there from Windows. Just FYI. Now, setting this up in Delphi is going to be a little interesting. The Windows Subsystem for Linux is not a virtual machine in the traditional sense. It's not a separate computer. It is on the same computer. So the IP address is the same. It's on the same computer. So the connection is going to be to 127.0.0.1, which is kind of weird, but that's the way it works. So go in here and say add profile name. We'll say Windows Subsystem for Linux and IP address 127.0.0.1. Now, you could have multiple instances of WSL running, but you'd need to bind them to different ports. You could also have a remote debugger for Windows on this machine as well on different ports. So just keep that in mind that those ports are finite, shared between the two systems. Now I'm coming here to SDK Manager, and we're going to add a platform. I'm going to say Linux, profile to connect, Windows Subsystem for Linux, and it says, I connected there, and that's 180403 LTS. Yep, that's what it is. So I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. And it's going to take a few minutes here to do this. You'll get some warning messages about not having RPM support because it looks for RPM or Debian packages, depending on, it doesn't know how to differentiate that, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. It doesn't bother differentiating that. That's a better way of putting it. So you may see warnings about that because this is a Debian-based system instead of an RPM-based system. And also, sometimes you'll get warnings about overwriting files, and I always just say, yes, overwrite them. There it is. So I always say yes to all. Okay, it finished, and I didn't get any log messages, interestingly. Usually I see something here about RPM, but that's okay, because no errors is a good thing, right? No warnings. All right, so we've got this set up now. So I'll go ahead and hit save. And now we're going to build our console application in here. New console application Delphi. And target platform and add platform Linux. And hello WSL. And now we'll run it. So let me bring up, so we have PA server running here. So now when I run this, we will see, so now in here, we'll see hello WSL. So there we go, ran it. Pretty straightforward. I mean, this isn't anything, if you've done Linux before, you probably like, okay, I could have figured that out. But that's the point. That's the beauty of it. This is the lightest weight way that you could have a Linux machine to test on without setting up an actual separate computer to run on. So very lightweight. It's there. It's running. So this is when it's going to start to get interesting here. So I've gone and did WSL-L, and we see we have Ubuntu now as well as the Ubuntu 18.04. So I'm going to set Ubuntu as my default. Set default. And now we list it, and it says, okay, that's your default. So now I can say WSL PA server, PA server. So I'm in Windows in DOS, and I'm going to launch PA server from here. So it's launched PA server, and I can run it. So this is really cool about WSL is it runs as it needs to be running. So you need to think about spinning it up, spinning it down. The overhead is minimal for WSL being running in WSL2. So I'm still using WSL1. WSL2, which currently is available on Insider build, but I decided I didn't want to push my luck and show that off for this, even though it sounds phenomenal. The performance improvement and the overhead is reduced significantly. So here I'm able to run my PA server from DOS. Okay, so I'm running, this is on Linux now, but it's being ran from DOS. So I will show you by going here, and my target platform is Linux and Ubuntu on Windows Subsystem for Linux, and come back in here, and there it is running. So I've just ran the Linux application on DOS. They're not DOS. I'm saying DOS, Windows command line, which is really cool. Thanks to the addition of FMX Linux, the Linux support now includes FireMonkey applications, full GUI desktop applications. How do we install those or run those on Windows Subsystem for Linux? Now, technically, from what I've read, they don't officially support the GUI desktop experience on Windows Subsystem for Linux. But when Microsoft's talking about it and showing it off, they always show this in there. So you need to have a X Windows server installed and running on your computer. I'm doing X410, I think is what it's called, which was, I think, $10. I bought it through the Windows Store. It's supposed to be the best one. I don't know. There's a couple other open source options as well. Feel free to use whichever one you want. I've installed all the additional packages I need, including the XFCE desktop windowing environment, because there isn't one installed by default. All that's documented, what you need to install for that. Once you've done that, then you just need to run the following command. It recommends creating a batch file, which I have slightly modified what they included there. But the first thing you're going to do is you're going to start the X server. So start, which is actually tells Windows to run. This is especially useful for running GUI commands because it runs it and then the DOS keeps going. So it spins it off into another process and doesn't make you stay in the command line waiting for it to run. And say bx410.exe, which is the name of the X server I'm running, and I'm going to run it in desktop mode. So what this is going to do is going to give me a full Linux desktop that then my apps will run on. Okay. You could also run it in non-desktop mode, which is multi-window, where you have just floating windows. It's up to you. Okay. So there it is. There it's running. It right now is just this translucent sheet of glass, which is kind of cool looking. And then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to launch Ubuntu with a parameter so that it launches the desktop environment. That helps if I don't erase it from my clipboard before trying to paste it. There it is. Okay, so this is Ubuntu. This is starting WSL. The running this command here, and in quotes, that's what's being ran. So it's doing some checking, export display, changing to the home directory instead of the current directory. Otherwise, it'd be mount C users Jim. I don't want to be starting there. I want to start in my home directory in the WSL. Start that session and then clean up kill the one of the agents in the background. Okay, so we're going to do that, and we're getting a bunch of warnings here. But boom, there it is. Now the cool thing is, this went from no WSL running to WSL with a desktop environment that quick. Pretty cool. It took me a while to warm up to WSL, but I really do like it now. So now I'm going to go PA server, and start it up. And then go into Delphi, and we're going to launch the good old controls demo in FMX Linux. And there it is. So, I mean, this is hopefully, if you were like, oh, I don't want to mess with the overhead of maintaining virtual machines and stuff like that, this is the solution here. Now, WSL2, which is currently available on the Insider build, is a lot of improvements. They're showing like a 4x improvement in performance, even though the performance is already really, really good, especially around file system performance. That's the big place they're seeing a big performance hit, because before, with WSL1, they were virtualizing the Windows file system, and now Linux has its own file system. And then they're also improving performance because they're going to a full Linux kernel, whereas right now they're emulating a Linux kernel. So Microsoft will be shipping a Linux kernel through Windows Update. So if you have WSL installed, which I really think you should, then you will have the Linux kernel installed and updating through Linux Update or Windows Update, which I guess will be Linux Update as well. Anyway, I mean this is better than virtual machine performance I've used as well. Just saying here, really nice. You can use any other environment you want to use. This is using, like I said, XFCE, which is a really lightweight one, which you might want to go with, or if you want to go with the full, what is it, Ubuntu Unity, I think is the default desktop, you can do that as well. You just need to look around about how to install that and launch it instead of XFCE. That's really all there is to it. It's pretty straightforward. They've improved this a lot since it first started out, so you want to be on 1903, which is the current non-insider build of Windows. Actually, that 1903 is not the build number, but you'll want to be on the current version of Windows 10 and in order to take advantage of all this. I put the finishing touches on automating this to be able to launch it from the IDE. Originally, I was thinking I could do it from the build events or as a host application, but the build events have to finish executing during that step in the process. So that doesn't work because you want it to keep running, and host application doesn't behave that way with Linux. Host application is specific for Windows. But what I did do is put it here under tools. So Ubuntu GUI and Ubuntu terminal. So I can go here to configure tools and show you how these work. The Ubuntu terminal just launches Ubuntu launching PA server. I could also do it. I guess I could have just put WSL here and just launch the default WSL, whatever that is. But I did it with Ubuntu, so you could have all your different distros here. And then for GUI, I have it launch the batch file that I created, which is right here. And so the batch file launches the X server here, X410 in my case, without a window in the background in desktop mode, and then launches Ubuntu, passing in this script here that exports the display, which is what connects it to the X server, changes directories, launches XFCE, and then when it's done, it shuts it down, everything down. So if I go here to, we'll do tools, Ubuntu terminal, of course, came up on the wrong window. There it is there, launches Ubuntu terminal. I can close that, and I can go tools, Ubuntu GUI, and there it is. Now, in order to get PA server running in here, it's different for each desktop manager, window manager. I came in here to settings, settings manager, and sessions and startup, application startup, and I added this item here, which this is the, so I'll make this bigger here. This is the command to launch terminal emulator, which if I right click on here and go properties and edit, I can see that command here. Okay. And then I just pass in the full path to PA server with the password to blank. You could specify, there's other options here for PA server. So I could actually use a password, I could use a pass file, etc. And so that does is that when it starts up, it automatically launches PA server. So with that way, I just hit run from here. And here it is running in Windows Subsystem for Linux. So maximum automation for your Linux testing. And it starts up just so fast. So it's really quite easy. Here, I'll close that. Tools, Ubuntu GUI, and hit run. Hit run. Switch back over here. And there it is. So nice. If you would like to learn more, here are some links here to the doc wiki on Linux application development, installing Platform Assistant Server, and FireMonkey for Linux, FMX Linux. And then if you want to know more about Windows Subsystem for Linux, here are some links here. The command line blog, it covers other things as well as WSL. Here's a Learning WSL articles, collection of articles on Microsoft site and their documentation. These are a couple of videos from Build, the last Build. This is a short 15-minute one, and it's on what's new in WSL, where they're talking about kind of where WSL's go, or talk a little bit about what WSL is, and then they talk about what's coming in WSL 2, which is available in the preview edition. The big thing there is that it's going to a full Linux kernel instead of an emulated kernel, which is a really big deal. So you're going to have full compatibility and a lot more functionality. There are things you couldn't do in WSL 1. And this is a deep dive into WSL, specifically WSL 2. So if you really want to understand how things are working, this is a great session for that. And now we're going to go to Q&A. Marco's on the line with me as well to help answering with the questions here, which I appreciate.
And I can also ask you the questions there of your reference. So one of the questions from Laszlo, if we can use Broadway instead.
Yeah, so I didn't test that, but Broadway is, I know that Broadway can run on a server without a Windows manager, but if you run, I know that if you run a FMX Linux application normally on without having a Windows manager running, it will fail. It'll give you an error message. But since Broadway will run without a window manager, it's designed, you can run it right from a server. I believe it should work. I haven't not tested it, but I believe it probably would work. It would just be on your 127.0.0.1 and then whatever port you have Broadway running on. So yeah, that should work, and you could do that instead of using the Windows, the X window server, like X410, like I was using. So yeah, interesting idea. I didn't test it, but I believe it should work.
Okay, yeah, there was another question about networking, and I think you showed that, yeah, the machine is on the same local host IP address.
Yeah, and interestingly, I tested when Windows Subsystem for Linux, not when it first came out, but when we launched our Linux support, I actually tested it, and I could not get the PA server, the ID to bind to the PA server. But I was reading that they've actually improved the networking a lot since then. So if you did test this before and it didn't work, it is working now. So yeah,
there was also a bug at the very beginning where the GDB wasn't working on the Windows Linux subsystem. That was a Microsoft limitation when it was first released, but I think Microsoft addressed it and now has debugging support, because that's critical for PA server to even start working. So
yep. Yeah, when I went down this path, I was like, well, at least we'll figure out how to run, or if you can run Delphi apps on there. Because like I said, I've done this before and I couldn't connect to debug, PA server to debug, but now it's like it's all working, and it was working really fast.
Okay, now we have two separate people asking if RadServer can be executed in the Windows Linux subsystem.
So I did not test that, but I see no reason why it wouldn't. It certainly seems that it should. Now, one note is the WSL1, which is what's the current release, is an emulation layer. WSL2, which is in Insider Preview, is a full Linux kernel. So Microsoft, they went out and grabbed the stable Windows kernel and made their own implementation of it. They made some changes to it so that it works in the Windows subsystem for Linux. And so now WSL2 is a full Linux kernel. So everything should work on WSL2, is what they're saying. So
yeah,
it doesn't work now. It will work most likely.
I think running RadServer as standalone, which is in the HTTP server, should work. Integrating with Apache might end up being a little more tricky, given like if you can use port 80 because there is IIS and port 80, I mean, you can really get into some trouble possibly. But but for the standalone server, which is now the drawback is that if you also want to run Interbase on that machine, I think I've seen bug reports about running Interbase on the Windows Linux subsystem. So that might be technically an issue if you want to get RadServer to run there.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to look at those and try them, because, like I said, they've made a lot of changes, and then it should be even better now that WSL 2 is out or coming out. So, yeah, if it didn't work before, it may work now, and if it doesn't work now, it should work with WSL 2.
Yeah, most likely that would become much easier also to run Interbase on the subsystem via the new version.
Now, one thing that's interesting about WSL 2 is there's the video, the deep dive into WSL 2, in the Q&A section at the end, they talk about this. If you're on Windows 10 and you're running like VMware or VirtualBox, you have to disable Hypervisor because it's not compatible. But apparently WSL 2 will use the hypervisor, so you have to re-enable the hypervisor for WSL 2 to work. But they said that they are working with like the Android debugger, the x86 Android debugger that Intel put out, and to make it compatible with the hypervisor, and they're also trying to work with VMware and VirtualBox. They said they didn't have any timelines or any of that stuff, but hopefully that will be fixed so that these will all work with hypervisor, because it sounds like WSL 2 will require that you enable the hypervisor, which may be a compatibility issue there. So that's something that you'll need to watch out for.
Okay, there's another question, is whether you can run VCL-based applications.
So VCL is Windows specific, but there is CrossVCL. I did not test this with CrossVCL because CrossVCL lets you run, take your VCL applications and target them to Mac OS and Linux. If you go to crossvcl.com, you can check that out. In theory, you could work on there, but I don't know. Didn't test it, so give it a shot. I expect it probably should work. If it, like I said, it doesn't work now, it'll probably work in WSL 2.
Okay, and I don't see any other question open right now. So if there's anything else you want to ask, just feel free to.
Paul put a comment here. It says, I have VirtualBox and no hypervisor and WSL working. So yeah, if you, with WSL 1 doesn't use hypervisor. WSL 2, which is on the insider build, you have to manually enable it, will require hypervisor. So that's where you might get the compatibility issue with VirtualBox. As far as when will WSL 2 be released, I don't know if they gave specifics on it. If you check out that deep dive video, they talk about, I think they do talk about it some in there, but I think they're only talked about when it would be available in the insider release. You could check out the command line blog though, that's the link's up there on the screen, aka MSCLI blog, and there may be details about release plans on that. But right now it's only on the insider build, so it's probably going to depend on how the feedback on that goes. Any chance have Android running under WSL? Trying to think. I don't know. It would be x86 Android, which libhoudini would make compatible. So if it was a recent Android,
yeah, it sounds tricky.
In theory, maybe, because Android is based on Linux, and you can make your own Linux distro to put on WSL. So I don't know, give it a shot. Let me know if you get it working. I would love to hear about it. Let's see.
There's another question about asking for a new webinar on using RadStudio on Windows Linux Subsystem, and also RadServer with Docker. Now, for RadServer with Docker, that's something we are considering, and it's on our roadmap and something we're working on. So stay tuned for that. Honestly, running RadStudio on Windows Linux Subsystem, it's kind of, I mean, if you want to do Windows testing, just, well, use the Windows version. I don't see a very big, push for that. When you're targeting a FireMonkey or a console app, then I think it makes more sense, because you want to. The console app is an easy way to simulate without a separate machine. The UI, it's different. I mean, it's not the same as a Windows application by any stretch. The UI rendering and how it looks, so it's very nice and handy. RadServer, which is fairly complex to set up and configure, at that point, either a Docker image or a VM probably make more sense, but we can certainly investigate.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know. I mean, the Windows Subsystem for Linux, I mean, it should. Yeah, it'd be something that might be tested, just because there's lots of moving parts to it. But it seems like it should work, and it certainly is a lighter weight solution. There's a question here about hardware system requirements to have a smooth experience like mine. So interestingly, in a VM, so this is a major plus for WSL versus a VM. In a VM, you say this virtual machine has two processor cores and 2 megs or 4 megs of memory or whatever you're going to assign to it, and that gets partitioned and set aside for that VM. With WSL, that doesn't happen. Even with WSL2, that won't happen. So depending on where you're using the memory at, your system will just allocate the memory to either Windows or WSL. So the advantage to that, I mean, that the whole purpose of paging file, right, is you could use most of your memory in WSL, then go over to the Windows side and would just read it back from the page file and then be using the memory over there. So it should work on a much more modest set of hardware than a VM would require. Now, if you're doing heavy things on both sides at the same time, then yeah, you're going to need to have more RAM. But it's nice that it's flexible in that regard. So I don't have any minimum hardware requirements. You might check the WSL docs and see if they have anything in there. Generally, I mean, just get a good system with lots of RAM and an SSD. I mean, that's just kind of general having a good developer machine.
Okay, there's another recommendation of using VCXR. I cannot read it. VCX server rather than the Xming for the X11 server for Windows.
Okay, yeah,
might be worth noticing.
Thank you for that. I tried one a while ago and didn't have any luck with it, and then like I said, I bought the X410. I was like, well, maybe this one will be easier. I don't remember which one I tried before, and then it was still like. It felt like the documentation was way too complicated. It's like, I just want this to work. And so that's why I tried to distill that down in here, hopefully, on this is what you need to do to get started with it. So yeah, I guess VCXSRV would be the one to try next if you don't want to buy the other one. The X410 is normally like $50, but it's on sale for $10 right now. Let's see, what's this? A Raspberry Pi? I've running Raspberry Pi apps. So if the Raspberry Pi app is designed for the ARM Linux, then it won't run on x86 Linux. But if it's in source code and can recompile, which a lot of them can, then yeah, it should work just fine in here, I would expect, unless it's trying to talk to the GPIOs or something like that. So it depends on the specifics of the app. All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us, and thanks Marco for helping out with the questions here. Appreciate it.
No problem. It was a very nice topic, so I wanted to attend anyway.
Oh yeah, I'm pretty excited about this. The speed at which it can spin up and spin down. I mean, it doesn't. There's not really a spin up and spin down. It's like on and off, you know. So it was just. I'm really pleased with that. It's much better than, in my mind, than in VM using VMs or an external machine. So I will continue to use this for my Linux, and yeah. And actually, the X or the WSL1 probably would work in a virtual machine. So if you're on a Mac computer with a Windows virtual machine, you could probably run WSL1 in the virtual machine. Interestingly, because it's not actually virtualized. So Miguel's asking again about hardware requirements. I don't know. I'm not even sure what my system is. RAM-wise, I would say anymore you want to have 16 gigs of RAM probably on your computer. That's just like kind of standard. And then a recent i7 processor, or actually the new AMD processors are like amazing. So our fairly recent processor that's, you know, not, you definitely don't want to go with like the budget end processors for sure. You know, the i5s, I guess they are now, are the low end ones. So you'd want an i7 or an i9, or, and I can't remember the indicator on the AMD side for what the higher end ones are, but you'd want to, you know, a fairly recent generation mid to high range processor, and at least I would say 16 gigs of RAM and an SSD. SSDs, so I heard it's official, SSDs are now cheaper than magnetic drives for moderate sizes. If you're wanting a big size, then magnetic drives are still cheaper, but for, you know, the 500 gigs to a terabyte, it's cheaper for an SSD than it is for a magnetic drive. So if you don't have an SSD, get an SSD. But that should get you going, Miguel. All right. Fantastic. Thank you so much, everybody. Oh, in the handout, there is a link to the blog post. The blog post is not live yet. I will be putting some more stuff in there shortly, and then getting it published later today. So the link is in the handout of the slides, but the blog post is not live yet. Running WSL along with RAD Studio hits the system performance. Yeah, so if you're running into performance issues, you might need to add more RAM. I mean, you look at your system, right? Your resource monitor, see if it's, you know, what's high. Is it RAM's high? Is it CPU utilization's high? And whatever is high is what you need to fix. It could be SSD as well. You know, if you're reading and writing, if you got an old magnetic drive, right? SSD is way faster. It's amazing how big a performance boost that can give you. So good luck with that. All right, thanks so much, everybody, and I will talk to you later. Take care.
Bye-bye.